You recognize and I realize. Does he realize? Have you worked? Where did you work? Do you work? Have you worked? That aren't. I realized we were not. Who were not? Good work. Doesn't matter. Go to work. Where you work. Where did you work? If we weren't. And you were not. We aren't. Doesn't matter. There were not. I didn't realize. I work. York. He worked. Do you recognize? Doesn't matter. I realized that you weren't. We worked. They worked. They worked. Doesn't matter. They don't recognize. Go to work. And you weren't. If you weren't. That aren't. She doesn't realize that we're not. I don't recognize. Do you work? Torque. Did he realize that we're not? As a matter of fact. Whether you recognize. Torque. They worked. We worked at night. Good work. They don't recognize. I recognize. You weren't. Have you worked? That were not. They realized they weren't. When I worked you weren't. They aren't. There were not. We worked. It doesn't work. We're not. I don't work. I didn't realize. It doesn't work. Do you work? She doesn't realize when you worked and you weren't. It doesn't matter. Do you work? Who works? Who worked? Do you work? I recognize. If he weren't. Does he work? Torque. At night. I work. And I realize there aren't. Why aren't? If you were not. He worked to work. It doesn't matter. She doesn't realize. Doesn't work. I recognize. They weren't. It doesn't matter. If he weren't. Who works? Doesn't matter. Doesn't work. Who aren't? I don't recognize. They realize. Who worked? Where you work. You work. Who were not. If he weren't. Do you work? You work. There aren't. They aren't. Did you work? They recognized. He worked. Go to work. There aren't. And you weren't. I realized. She doesn't realize you weren't. I recognized. If you weren't. At work. Whether you recognize. Go to work. There were not. They weren't. They aren't. When you worked. If we weren't. You weren't. They recognized. When you worked. I didn't recognize. Who works? Where you work. And you weren't. It doesn't work. Why aren't? Did he realize? At night. Did you realize? Why aren't? Do you work? It worked. York. Doesn't work. Does he work? Who works? Do you realize? Do you realize you aren't? You worked. She works. Whether you recognize. If we weren't. And you were not. He doesn't realize that. You weren't. And I realize. She doesn't realize. Doesn't matter. They didn't realize you worked. Did he realize? I didn't recognize. Does he realize? That aren't. Does he realize? I worked. Where did you work? He doesn't realize. I recognized. That works. Have you worked? I realized. Where do you work? We aren't. We were not. Did you recognize? Do you realize? You realized. Did he realize? They didn't realize. You realized. As a matter of fact. She realized. When I worked. When I worked. Did you work? Doesn't matter. If we weren't. Who works? I didn't realize. Did you work? They didn't realize. That we're not. Who were not. They don't realize. Did you realize he worked? You worked. Who aren't? I recognized. You were not. Doesn't work. We weren't. You were not. I recognized. That works. It doesn't work. It worked. It doesn't work. She realized. Do you realize it work? I don't recognize. You recognize. I realized. Do you recognize? He worked. They weren't. You aren't. I recognized. Did you realize? I don't recognize. We aren't. You aren't. They were not. Who aren't? Did he recognize? They recognized. You recognize. Do you recognize? We aren't. We worked. If you weren't and you were not. It worked. They weren't. They were not to work. Did he recognize? When you worked? It doesn't work if you were not. If we weren't, we aren't. At work we worked. Have you worked? Do you recognize? It worked. I recognized. You worked. I work. There aren't. Torque. Who works? We aren't. Where did you work? And I realize. Does he work? You recognize. He didn't recognize. They didn't realize. He didn't recognize. At night. You work. Who worked? We were not. Where did you work? Whether you recognize. You were not. We weren't. You worked. Who works? Who aren't? Did you recognize? She works. They realize. When I worked. They didn't realize. Have you worked? She doesn't realize. York. Do you realize? She doesn't realize. You realize. You were not. We were not at work. He worked. Does he work? Where do you work? Where did you work? There aren't. He doesn't realize. Have you worked? Whether you recognize. I recognize. Who were not. I don't work. That works. They weren't. You work. I didn't recognize. It worked. They recognized. He worked. She didn't realize. Did he recognize? It doesn't matter. At night. If you weren't. Torque. She doesn't realize. You realize. Does he work? Good work. At work. Who worked? Who were not. I didn't realize. Why aren't? Who worked? I didn't recognize. That works. We weren't. Who were not. Did you work? Did you realize? We worked. Where did you work? Have you worked? Do you work? I didn't realize. You recognize. You worked. It worked. We were not. Do you recognize? They realize. Good work. That works. Did you work? They realize. I recognized. I didn't realize. I recognize. I realize. You worked. He worked. York. You weren't. Have you worked? They recognized. That aren't. I recognize. I recognized. They don't recognize. You realized. Did you recognize? You realized the work. If you were not. I worked. I recognize. That were not. She didn't realize the work. And you weren't. They didn't realize. That aren't. That aren't. I didn't realize. That aren't. Do you recognize? I worked. You work. Does he work? Does he realize? Doesn't work. I realize. If you were not. That were not. I didn't realize. When I worked. We weren't. They aren't. I don't work. I didn't recognize. I don't recognize. They aren't. Good work. I recognized. Who worked? If he weren't. At night. York. As a matter of fact. To work. We aren't. You aren't. We weren't. You recognize. Did you work? Did you recognize? They recognized. Where do you work? You realized to work. There were not. He doesn't. Realize they worked. He worked. It worked if we weren't. Who works? I worked and you weren't. Have you worked at night? Where did you work? You worked. You aren't. You worked. You realized it doesn't matter. And I realize. I don't work. Did you work? Torque. Did he realize you work? And I realize you realized. Did you realize? Where did you work? Do you recognize? Go to work. Did you work? I worked. They were not. Why aren't? Why aren't? As a matter of fact. Where did you work? You realized. Did you realize? They recognized. If he weren't. He doesn't realize. It doesn't matter. They don't realize. I don't work when you worked. I realize and you were not. I don't recognize. I don't recognize. When I worked. I didn't recognize. You realized doesn't work. And you weren't. And you were not. Did he recognize? At work. Doesn't work. There were not. If we weren't. I didn't realize. I don't work. They weren't. If you were not. Torque. Have you worked? They aren't. At work. I recognized. That were not. And you weren't. I didn't recognize. Did he realize it worked? Where do you work? She works. They didn't realize and I realize. You realize he worked. They don't recognize. I realized. I didn't realize. I recognized. They don't realize. Did he recognize? Did he realize? Good work. I don't work. We aren't. If he weren't. It doesn't matter. They weren't. We were not. They weren't. Do you recognize? Doesn't work. We weren't. Why aren't? They realize. I recognized. Go to work. You were not. That were not. Where do you work? I didn't realize. There aren't. At work. Did he recognize? He worked. Did you recognize? He worked. Why aren't? I worked. You aren't. Good work. He recognized. They were not. Where do you work? You recognize. There aren't. Doesn't matter. When you worked the work. She realized. Who aren't. As a matter of fact. I recognized. Good work. Who aren't. We aren't. Do you recognize? We weren't. They recognized. You realized. If he weren't. They weren't. Where do you work? At night. And you were not. And you weren't. Where you work. Have you worked? I don't work. They don't realize. There were not. That were not. You aren't. He recognized. They were not. They weren't. If you weren't. You were not. They didn't realize. I recognize. Good work. As a matter of fact. Does he realize? Good work. As a matter of fact. If he weren't. Did you?